The call came at 3:47 a.m. Three sharp rings that cut through the darkness like a blade. My grandfather was dead. Heart attack, they said. Sudden. Peaceful. But nothing about the next 6 months would be peaceful. Nothing about what my stepfather Richard would do to our family's legacy would even resemble peace. I should have seen it coming the moment he walked into the funeral reception wearing that $1,000 suit, working the room like he owned it. Like he owned us. The way he pressed flesh with board members, the way his eyes lit up when they discussed the transition of power. My grandfather's body wasn't even cold yet, and Richard was already measuring the throne. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a 24-year-old college dropout brought down a corporate predator who thought he could steal a $250 million empire. My name is Alex Chun, and this is how I destroyed the man who tried to destroy everything my grandfather built. The morning after the funeral, I found myself standing in Grandpa's office at Chun Industries headquarters. 50 floors above the city streets, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that made you feel like you were floating in the clouds. This was where Eugene Chun had built his empire from nothing, where he turned a small manufacturing startup into one of the largest supply chain companies on the West Coast. The leather chair behind his massive oak desk still carried the faint scent of his cologne. Old Spice and determination, I used to joke. Now, it just smelled like loss. Richard's voice echoed from the conference room down the hall. He was already in meetings with the executive team, already making decisions. The will hadn't even been read yet, but he was moving like a man who knew exactly what was coming his way. My mother had married Richard 3 years earlier, when I was away at college. A whirlwind romance, she called it. Looking back, I think the only thing that moved like a whirlwind was how quickly Richard positioned himself next to the Chin family fortune. Grandpa never liked him, but he tolerated him for Mom's sake. He'd pull me aside at family dinners and shake his head. Something about that man doesn't sit right with me, Alex. Keep your eyes open. I should have listened harder. The will reading was scheduled for that afternoon. The entire family gathered in the law offices of Morrison, Blake and Associates, the firm that had handled Grandpa's affairs for 30 years. I sat between my mother and my younger sister Jamie, watching Richard pace near the windows like a caged animal waiting to be fed. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat and began reading the formal language that would reshape all our lives. The house in Pacific Heights went to my mother. Various investments and trust funds were divided among the grandchildren. And then came the big moment. The controlling interest in Chun Industries, representing 62% of company shares, was left in trust to me until my 25th birthday. In the meantime, operational control would fall to my stepfather Richard as interim CEO, with the understanding that he would guide the company until I was ready to take over. Richard's smile could have powered the building. But there was more. A smaller provision that everyone seemed to gloss over. A provision about Grandpa's personal effects, including all contents of his private office and home study. Those went directly to me, effective immediately. Richard didn't seem concerned about furniture and old photographs. He was too busy calculating his yearly salary as CEO of a $250 million company. I spent that first week watching Richard settle into power like he was born for it. New assistant, new office furniture, new policies that somehow always seemed to benefit his old business contacts. He moved through the building like he owned it, and everyone treated him accordingly. After all, he was family now. He was the man Eugene Chun had trusted enough to run his empire. But late at night, when the executive floors were empty, I would sit in Grandpa's old office going through boxes of his personal files. Financial records dating back decades. Handwritten notes about deals and partnerships. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that made my blood run cold. 3 weeks after the funeral, I found the first smoking gun. Hidden in a folder marked Personal Correspondence 2018 to 2019, I discovered a series of emails between my grandfather and a private investigator named Marcus Webb. The subject line on the first email made me stop breathing. Background check. Richard Blackwood urgent. My stepfather's last name was Blackwood, not Black like he'd told our family. And according to Marcus Webb's investigation, Richard had quite a history under his real name. 2 failed businesses in Nevada, a bankruptcy in Arizona, and most damning of all, a pattern of marrying wealthy widows and somehow ending up in control of their finances shortly before those marriages fell apart. My mother was his third wife. She was also the wealthiest. The investigators' final report was dated just 2 weeks before Grandpa's heart attack. His conclusion was stark. Richard Blackwood was a professional predator who had been systematically positioning himself to gain control of Chin Industries from the moment he met my mother. But Richard had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated Eugene Chen's paranoia and his habit of documenting everything. As I dug deeper into Grandpa's files, I found backup hard drives, encrypted folders, and a paper trail that painted a devastating picture of Richard's true intentions. Financial projections showing how he planned to get the company and sell off its most valuable assets. Draft contracts with potential buyers. Even recorded phone conversations where Richard discussed his long-term strategy with unknown partners. The man wasn't just stealing our company. He was planning to dismantle it piece by piece. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. In the bottom drawer of Grandpa's desk, locked behind a panel I almost missed, I found a manila envelope marked, "If something happens to me." Inside were copies of forged documents, falsified medical records, and a detailed timeline showing how Richard had been slowly poisoning my grandfather with digitalis, a heart medication that could trigger fatal cardiac episodes when given to someone with no heart condition. My grandfather hadn't died of natural causes. He'd been murdered. And the man who killed him was now running his company. I spent the next 2 weeks in a state of barely controlled rage, watching Richard play the grieving stepson while systematically destroying everything Grandpa had built. He fired 3 department heads who had been with the company for over a decade. He canceled contracts with longtime partners and replaced them with suppliers who offered kickbacks. He even had Grandpa's portrait removed from the lobby and replaced with some generic corporate art. But I couldn't go to the police yet. The evidence was strong, but circumstantial. And Richard was too smart to leave obvious fingerprints on his crimes. He'd built plausible deniability into every decision, every document, every move. I needed something more. Something that would destroy him so completely he couldn't weasel his way out with expensive lawyers and political connections. That's when I remembered the emergency board provision. During the will reading, Mr. Morrison had mentioned a clause that would allow for an emergency board vote if the interim CEO's performance was deemed detrimental to the company's interests. It required a majority vote from board members, but it could be triggered by any significant shareholder, including me. As the majority owner, even in trust, I had the right to call an emergency meeting within 72 hours' notice. And thanks to the pandemic, the board had been conducting all meetings via Zoom, which meant Richard's downfall would be broadcast live to 12 of the most powerful business leaders on the West Coast. I spent the next week preparing my case like I was going to trial. Every financial irregularity Richard had authorized, every questionable contract he'd signed, every employee he'd fired without cause. I built a presentation that painted a picture of a company in decline under his leadership. But I saved the murder evidence for the grand finale. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at 2 p.m. I sent out the official notice on Tuesday, citing concerns about operational decisions negatively impacting company performance and employee morale, standard corporate language that wouldn't tip off Richard to what was coming. He cornered me in the elevator that Wednesday morning, his usual charming smile nowhere to be found. "What's this board meeting about, Alex? Some of the directors are asking questions." "Just standard oversight," I told him, "making sure we're staying true to Grandpa's vision for the company." His eyes narrowed, but he couldn't push too hard without looking suspicious. After all, as the future owner, I had every right to ensure the company was being properly managed. He had no idea I'd already spoken privately with 6 of the board members, including Margaret Walsh, the company's longtime chief financial officer who had been like a second grandmother to me. She'd noticed the same financial irregularities I had, but hadn't felt comfortable challenging the CEO directly. When I showed her my evidence, her face went white. "Alex, if even half of this is true, we have to act immediately. The company won't survive another 6 months of this kind of mismanagement. By Thursday night, I had 7 board members committed to voting Richard out. Magic number. But I wanted more than a simple termination. I wanted complete annihilation. Friday morning felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. I arrived at the office early and spent an hour in Grandpa's chair, looking out at the city he'd helped build. Somewhere in those towers below, Richard was probably having his morning coffee, completely unaware that his corporate empire was about to collapse around him. At 1:45 p.m., I logged into the Zoom meeting from the conference room. One by one, the board members joined the call. Familiar faces appeared in their individual squares, looking appropriately formal for what they assumed would be a routine oversight meeting. Richard joined at exactly 2 p.m., impeccably dressed and radiating confidence. He had no reason to suspect anything. The first 30 minutes proceeded normally. I presented standard performance metrics and raised questions about recent operational changes. Richard responded with his usual corporate speak, deflecting criticism and spinning every negative trend as a necessary adjustment period. Several board members asked pointed questions about the employee terminations and contract changes, but Richard had prepared answers for those. He was smooth, professional, completely in control. That's when I dropped the first bomb. I shared my screen and displayed a financial analysis showing how Richard's decisions had cost the company over $15 million in just 6 weeks. Canceled contracts with longtime partners. Terminated relationships with reliable suppliers. Employee turnover at an all-time high. Richard's composure cracked slightly. This wasn't the routine meeting he'd expected. "Alex, I think you're misunderstanding some necessary restructuring decisions," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge. "These short-term adjustments will position us for long-term growth." I let him talk for another 5 minutes, digging his own grave deeper with every corporate buzzword and empty promise. The board members' expressions grew increasingly skeptical as I presented chart after chart showing declining performance across every metric that mattered. Then I moved to phase 2. "Richard," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I need to ask you directly about your background before joining our family. Specifically about your previous business ventures under the name Richard Blackwood." The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Richard's face went completely pale, then flushed red as 12 board members stared at him through their computer screens. "I don't know what you're implying, Alex, but I think personal attacks are inappropriate for a board meeting." "I'm not attacking anyone," I replied. "I'm sharing factual information about the man we've entrusted with leadership of this company." I pulled up Marcus Webb's investigative report and began reading the highlights. 2 bankruptcies. 3 failed marriages to wealthy women. A pattern of financial improprieties spanning 15 years. The board members listened in stunned silence as I methodically destroyed Richard's carefully constructed facade. Margaret Walsh spoke first. "Richard, are these allegations accurate?" Richard tried to mount a defense, claiming the report was biased and that his past mistakes had taught him valuable lessons about business management. But his voice shook, and sweat was visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. I wasn't finished. The next slide showed the forged documents from Grandpa's secret files. The falsified records that Richard had used to gain my mother's trust. The manufactured references from business associates who turned out not to exist. Each revelation hit like a hammer blow. Board members who had respected Richard began asking increasingly hostile questions. His carefully crafted image was disintegrating in real time, broadcast live to the people whose opinions mattered most in his new world. But I'd saved the best for last. "There's one more thing the board needs to know," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 6 weeks' worth of suppressed rage. "My grandfather didn't die of natural causes." The silence was deafening. 12 squares of shocked faces stared at me through their computer screens. Richard looked like he was about to vomit. I shared the timeline I'd constructed from Grandpa's files. The gradual introduction of digitalis into his daily medication routine. The careful escalation designed to look like a worsening heart condition. The final fatal dose administered just days after Grandpa had completed his investigation into Richard's background. Eugene Chin discovered that Richard was planning to destroy this company. I continued. And Richard killed him to prevent that information from coming to light. Richard was shaking now, his composure completely shattered. This is insane, Alex. You're accusing me of murder based on some conspiracy theory cooked up by a grieving kid who can't accept that his grandfather had a heart condition. But his protest sounded hollow. The evidence was overwhelming, and everyone on the call could see it. Margaret Walsh took control of the meeting. Given the serious nature of these allegations, I moved to immediately suspend Richard Blackwood from all duties as CEO, pending a full investigation. I second that motion, came another voice. The vote was unanimous. 12-0. Richard's face went through a spectrum of emotions. Shock, denial,
Rage.
and finally, something that looked almost like relief. Like he was exhausted from maintaining his facade and almost grateful it was finally over. He tried to speak, but I cut him off. Richard, effective immediately, you are terminated as CEO of Chun Industries. Security will escort you from the building within the hour. All company property, including laptops, phones, and access cards, must be surrendered before you leave. Margaret Walsh would serve as interim CEO while the board conducted a proper search for permanent leadership. The company would survive. The employees would keep their jobs. Grandpa's legacy would be preserved. But most importantly, justice would finally be served. After the call ended, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time, watching the sun set over the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a profound sense of exhaustion.
And sadness.
Because destroying Richard didn't bring Grandpa back. It didn't undo the betrayal my mother would feel when she learned the truth about the man she'd married. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret Walsh. The police are on their way. Well done, Alex. Eugene would be proud. Richard was arrested that evening at his penthouse apartment. The evidence was turned over to the district attorney's office, along with Marcus Webb's investigative files and my grandfather's documented timeline of the poisoning. The case made headlines for months. Corporate executive charged with murder in $250 million inheritance scheme. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Richard's expensive lawyers tried every trick in the book, but the evidence was ironclad. Financial records, recorded conversations, medical testimony about digitalis poisoning, and most damning of all, Richard's own behavior during that board meeting, broadcast and recorded for posterity. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict him on charges of first-degree murder and corporate fraud. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. My mother filed for divorce while he was awaiting sentencing. She'd spent months in counseling, trying to process the fact that she'd shared a bed with the man who murdered her father. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss could have. She'd genuinely loved Richard, and he'd manipulated those feelings to position himself for the biggest theft of his career. Chun Industries not only survived but thrived under new leadership. Margaret Walsh served as CEO for 2 years while I finished my business degree and learned the ropes from the ground up. By my 25th birthday, I was ready to take over, armed with knowledge that went far beyond what any MBA program could teach. The experience taught me that blood doesn't always make family, and family doesn't always deserve trust. But it also showed me the power of preparation, patience, and having the courage to act when action is required. Sometimes justice isn't served by the system. Sometimes you have to serve it yourself. Eugene Chen's portrait was returned to the lobby within days of Richard's termination. Every morning when I arrive at the office, I pause in front of it and remember the lesson Grandpa tried to teach me all those years ago at family dinners.
Keep your eyes open, Alex. Trust but verify.
And never underestimate the power of documentation. The company he built now employs over 3,000 people across 12 states. We're profitable, growing, and committed to the values Eugene Chen established when he started this journey decades ago. Integrity, excellence, family. Richard Blackwood learned the hard way that some families fight back when you threaten what they love. He spent 3 years positioning himself to steal our legacy, manipulating our trust, and ultimately murdering the man who built it all. But he made one fatal error in his calculations. He underestimated the grandson who inherited more than just company shares. I inherited Eugene Chen's paranoia, his attention to detail, and his absolute refusal to let anyone destroy what he'd built. Richard thought he was stealing from a naive college kid who didn't understand business. Instead, he found himself facing someone who'd learned from one of the finest strategic minds in corporate America. The last time I saw Richard was during the sentencing hearing. He looked older, broken, completely defeated. As they led him away in shackles, he glanced back at me one final time. I met his eyes and gave him the same smile he'd worn at Grandpa's funeral.
Cold. Calculating.
Victorious. Some might say I destroyed a man's life. That's true. But he destroyed my grandfather's life first. He poisoned a 78-year-old man who had never done anything but welcome him into our family. He betrayed my mother's love and trust. He planned to get a company that employed thousands of people, all for his personal profit. Richard Blackwood made his choices. I simply made sure he faced the consequences. The desk where I found all that evidence still sits in my office. Grandpa's old oak desk, with its hidden compartments and secret drawers. Sometimes late at night, when I'm working on quarterly reports or reviewing expansion plans, I run my hands over the wood and remember that morning when everything changed. 3 rings at 3:47 a.m. A phone call that shattered our world and set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately preserve everything Eugene Chen had built. I kept one item from that manila envelope marked, "If something happens to me," a handwritten note, dated just 2 days before Grandpa's death, that I found tucked behind the murder evidence. Alex, if you're reading this, then my suspicions about Richard were correct. You have everything you need to protect the company and get justice for what he's done. I know you'll make the right choices. The company is in good hands. I'm proud of you, Grandpa. Even facing his own murder, Eugene Chen was still 3 steps ahead of his killer. He prepared everything I needed to bring Richard down, trusting that I would find it and act on it when the time came. That's the kind of strategic thinking that built Chen Industries from nothing into a $250 million empire. And it's the same thinking that will carry us into the future. Richard Blackwood thought he could steal our legacy. Instead, he gave me the motivation to become worthy of it. The old man would have been proud of that board meeting. 12 corporate executives watching a 24-year-old college dropout systematically destroy a professional predator with nothing but facts, evidence, and the moral authority that comes from fighting for justice. Sometimes the good guys win. Sometimes the paper trail is stronger than all the charm and manipulation in the world. And sometimes a grandfather's love reaches beyond the grave to protect the family he left behind. This is what happens when you underestimate the power of preparation and the fury of someone defending their family's honor. This is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness and youth for naivety. Richard learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Eugene Chen's grandson was ready for war from the moment he walked into that office and found the evidence. The war is over now. Justice has been served. The company thrives under leadership that honors its founders' values. And somewhere, I hope, Eugene Chen is watching over us with satisfaction, knowing that his final strategy succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. That hidden desk held more than evidence. It held the tools of redemption and the blueprint for justice. Every day I sit behind that desk, I remember that legacy isn't just about money or power or corporate success. It's about the choices you make when everything you love is under attack. It's about having the courage to fight back when fighting back is the only option left. Richard Blackwood will spend the rest of his life in prison, destroyed by the same ambition that drove him to murder. And Chen Industries will continue to grow and prosper, protected by the grandson who learned that sometimes the most important business lesson comes not from textbooks or boardrooms, but from a grandfather's final act of love. 3 rings at 3:47 a.m. changed everything. But they also revealed everything I needed to preserve the legacy of the man who built it all. That's how you destroy a predator. That's how you protect what matters most. And that's how you honor the memory of someone who saw the danger coming and gave you everything you needed to survive it. Eugene Chen's greatest victory wasn't building a $250 million company. It was raising a grandson who would fight to preserve it when the moment of truth arrived.